Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Running Man by Stephen King. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't you review this already? And that's right, I did back in 2016. However, my older review is no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you can still see it with a link, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my old review of The Running Man. But The Running Man is a novel that I was planning on rereading for a while now, and not to get too political, but with 2025 being the way it is, and with the recent film adaptation of The Running Man, I thought now is as good of a time as any to explore this story again. Now, The Running Man is a dystopian novel published in 1982, and this was originally published under King's pen name, Richard Bachman, which is a pseudonym that he used frequently early in his career. Now, while this was published in 1982, it was actually written in 1973, a year before the publication of King's first published novel, Carrie. Now, before the publication of Carrie, Stephen King and his family were basically living in poverty. I believe King was working as a high school teacher at the time, but him and his wife were really struggling to make ends meet. I know they were living in a trailer at the time, and apparently this was written during winter break when King and his family were snowed in, and supposedly Stephen King wrote this over the course of 3 days.
There was a snowstorm during February vacation in February of 1973. I was teaching school then, so I was on vacation. I was in my double-wide trailer with 2 kids and my wife. It snowed. It snowed us in, and we were somewhere out in the country, and I decided that I was going to take that week and see if I could write a book. I had the idea for The Running Man, and I wrote it. I wrote it in a week, and it sat in a drawer, finished, for, I think, probably 9 years, 10 years, something like that. And at that point, I was publishing novels with Viking and Signet in paperback, and they had published one of my books under the Richard Bachman name, and I had this other one, The Running Man, and I published that as a paperback original.
Now, Carrie's the book that really brought Stephen King and his family out of poverty, and I would say especially the Brian De Palma film adaptation 2 years later really shot King into the mainstream. And of course, with the publication of his novels like Salem's Lot, The Shining, and The Stand, King was really starting to become a household name, but he had written several novels prior to Carrie, not just The Running Man, but several other stories that at the time he couldn't get published, but now that he was becoming a very famous writer, he wanted to get these stories published, but he felt that the writing style wasn't really on the same level of the books he was publishing at the time, and he thought they were so radically different from what he was publishing at the time. That, and he also wanted to see if people were buying his books legitimately for the quality of the work, or simply because they had the name Stephen King attached to them. So he decided to publish these stories under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, but Bachman was more than just a pseudonym. He actually came up with a fake backstory for Bachman, and his agent had his friend pose for a picture to put on the back of the books. Like, they really tried to make it look like Richard Bachman was a real person, and that Bachman and Stephen King were 2 separate people. Now, the other Bachman books are Rage, which is actually a book that's very hard to come by now because it deals with a school shooting, and there were several real-life school shootings years later where the perpetrators were found with copies of this book, so after that, Stephen King allowed the book to go out of print.
When I wrote it, I started it when I was in high school, and I finished it when I was in college. And I published it under the Bachman pen name, and it didn't garner a lot of attention. It was certainly never a bestseller. but it was found in the effects of several different kids. Well, I won't say several, but two at least kids who were involved with school shootings. One of them, thank God, nobody was hurt or killed. The kid just surrendered. But with the other one, there were deaths and there were injuries, and that was enough for me. I don't think that books or movies are ever the cause of this sort of violence. And I don't think that's true of video games either. I think that of all the kids who play these things, somewhere among them are kids upon whom a certain violent scenario will act as an accelerant or give them a path that they might not have figured out on their own, and they'll do something that's violent. I think in most cases, if they don't find that book or that movie that they want to act out, that they will do something else.
Then you had The Long Walk, which is another dystopian novel, which actually makes a very interesting companion piece to The Running Man. Then you had Roadwork, then you had The Running Man. After The Running Man, you had Thinner, which I'm pretty sure was the final Bachman book before King was outed as Bachman. Now, years later, he would publish The Regulators and Blaze under the Richard Bachman pseudonym, but at that point, it was already common knowledge that Richard Bachman was a pseudonym for Stephen King, and he just published them under that pen name, really just as a joke and sort of a wink-wink, nudge-nudge to his fans. Now, in 1985, after King was outed as Bachman, the first 4 Bachman books, including The Running Man, were published in this collection, appropriately named the Bachman Books. This particular collection is one of the only ways you could really find rage anymore, which is the main reason I got it. Now, a big thing with the Bachman books is you can tell Stephen King was a young man when he wrote a lot of these. Like, I think he wrote a lot of the Bachman books when he was in his late teens and early 20s, and you can kind of tell. There's a certain, I don't want to say amateurish nature to them, but there's a certain rawness to them. Like, you can tell they're the books of a young man, particularly an angry young man, and to a certain extent, some of the Bachman stories really do feel like they're written by an edgy teenager or an edgy early 20-something. The Bachman stuff is also much pulpier than King's typical work, and they're typically very angry, very nihilistic stories. Depending on your mindset, that could either be a positive or a negative. I know people who love the Bachman stuff and consider it to be some of Stephen King's best work, and then I know people who absolutely can't stand the Bachman books. Except for The Long Walk. The Long Walk is almost universally praised as one of Stephen King's best stories. Now, I first read The Running Man back in 2010 when I was 17, which I feel like is the perfect age to read a book like this at. Like, this really does feel like the novel of a young man. Like, this really feels like a young man's novel. Like, there was something about it that at that age I really gravitated towards, and I thought it was such a breath of fresh air for Stephen King, because honestly, even today, this is a very atypical Stephen King book, and compared to a lot of his other stories, it's much tighter and much more fast-paced than your typical Stephen King story. Not that that's a problem for other King stories. Like, I don't mind when King sort of veers off into random subplots or goes into the backstories of, like, random characters, but for The Running Man, like, it's nice to have a break from the norm, and I like that this book, again, is just such a tightly paced story. And upon this reread, the book is certainly not perfect, but I still consider it to be one of my favorite Stephen King stories, and it is one of my favorite dystopian novels. Now, don't get me wrong, this will never be as good as books like George Orwell's 1984, or Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, or even Alan Moore's V for Vendetta, or even Stephen King's other dystopian story, The Long Walk. Regardless, this really has become, especially in recent years, one of King's most relevant stories. Now, Stephen King does seem to be borrowing heavily from a 1959 Robert Sheckley short story called The Prize of Peril, which had previously been adapted into the 1970 German film The Millions Game, which has a very similar premise to that of The Running Man. There's also a 1971 Peter Watkins film called Punishment Park, which, again, has a lot of similar ideas to that of The Running Man. Punishment Park, by the way, is probably one of the most anxiety-inducing films I've ever seen in my life. And I mean, talk about a movie that is so relevant to today's society, and that's Punishment Park. That movie is fucking terrifying. So, the plot of The Running Man is it's set in a dystopic future. It's actually set in the year 2025, which is the year we're currently in. But keep in mind, when this was written, that would have been the future. And basically, in this future society, the United States government is implied to be, if not full-fledged fascist, then definitely very, very corrupt. And the economy is in complete shambles, and the disparity between the rich and the poor has gotten so bad that people lower on the economic ladder, like people living in poverty, are pretty much looked at as second-class citizens by middle-class people and by the upper class. And people are pretty much controlled by the media, and all media is state-run. In fact, it's a law that all homes have to have television sets or what they call freebies in this world. And game shows in this future have become much more violent, where contestants can be seriously hurt or sometimes even killed on these game shows. Like, in a lot of ways, game shows have basically become snuff films. And by and large, the contestants on these game shows are poor people who are desperate to earn some money and get themselves out of poverty, and we realize that basically the network uses these game shows not just as a way to humiliate the poor, but also control the lower class. But the novel follows a man named Ben Richards who is unemployed because he's been fired from basically all of his jobs for insubordination, but also his last job he was working at a nuclear power plant and there were some radiation leaks and he was fired simply for complaining about this. And his wife is working as a prostitute so they could make ends meet, and their daughter is very sick. So in order to get money to afford a doctor for their sick daughter, Richard signs up to be on one of these game shows, and he ultimately gets picked out to be on the network's most popular game show, The Running Man. And basically, on The Running Man, contestants are treated as fugitives and are being pursued by the police, as well as a team of highly trained assassins. And ordinary citizens are encouraged to turn these contestants in, and it's actually illegal to be harboring a contestant of The Running Man. And more we realize that the government really uses The Running Man as a way to get rid of undesirables, which they see Ben Richards as. And as Richards is being pursued by these assassins, or hunters as they're called, he ends up getting caught up in this underground resistance against the network and the government. Now, like I said, Stephen King apparently wrote this over a period of a few days, and you can kinda tell. I mean, I'm sure it was probably edited before it was actually published, but at the same time, it's not as polished as King's later works are. Like, it has this real sort of unfiltered, unpolished, and raw quality to it. But again, that's something I really like about the book. It also has this sort of pulpy, hard-boiled feel to it, which I also really like. But it's also a very angry, very nihilistic story too, which again is fitting in with a lot of the other Bachman books. It's also a very anti-authoritarian story. Like, it really does feel like this was born out of that 60s counterculture and that post-Vietnam, post-Watergate distrust of the government and distrust of authority. And yes, I know this was written in 73, which I think was a year before the Watergate scandal, but you know what I mean. But also, knowing that this book was written when King was working as a high school teacher and was really struggling to make ends meet. You can tell some of this book is really King sort of working out his own frustrations living in poverty. And the ending of this book, the ending is a fucking gut punch. No, the ending is a punch in the gut and the nuts at the same time. Like, the ending is very downbeat, but there is a strange positivity to it because it is implied that what Ben Richards does at the end will kick off some kind of spark that might potentially start an uprising among the lower class. But at the same time, we don't know for sure, and while Ben Richards certainly does a lot of damage to the network at the end, we don't know if he truly or permanently brought down the network, and we don't know if anything's really going to change in this society or not. And ultimately, we don't know if his sacrifice is going to amount to anything. I also gotta say, what happens to Ben Richards towards the end of this is fucking disgusting. If you've read the book, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but let's just say, don't be eating while you're reading the last 15 or 20 pages of this book, because it is fucking stomach-churning what ends up happening to him. Now, Ben Richards is almost a pure anti-hero in this, because while you do root for him, he's also not always the most likable character. There are times where he's a complete asshole. Granted, you do kinda understand it because this is a guy who's been screwed over his whole life and he's in a very desperate situation, so you don't blame him for being such an asshole. But he does do things in this that likely got innocent people killed. Granted, it's for his own survival, and really all he cares about is winning this game so he could get money for his daughter. So again, you sort of don't blame him, but again, that definitely makes him an anti-hero in the story. Also, some of his interactions with women in this book is definitely kind of questionable. For example, towards the beginning of the story, as he's going through sort of a training process and a screening process, one of the women interviewing him at the games building, he borderline sexually harasses this woman. Now, the way he sort of justifies it to himself is this woman is working for a very evil, very corrupt corporation, so in his mind, this woman barely qualifies as a person. I think that's sort of how the character justifies it to himself, but that's still no excuse. Also, later on in the book, Richards ends up abducting this woman, this civilian named Amelia Williams, and taking her hostage as a way to keep the hunters from killing him. And this woman is almost completely brainwashed by the network. Like, she's completely swallowed all the propaganda that the network has been feeding the public about Ben Richards, and at one point, Richards says to himself in his head, I would like to drag this woman out into the street, beat her, and rape her. Now, he doesn't actually mean that he wants to do something like that. It's just the woman makes him so angry that he kind of wants to show this woman how cruel the world actually is and how bad things are for the lower class. Again, he doesn't actually want to do something like that. It's just sort of in his anger he thinks something like that. But again, it's very off-putting. Also, the main villain of the book is the executive producer of The Running Man, a man named Dan Killian, who in the novel is described as a black man, and towards the end of the book, Richards calls him the N-word. Granted, he does do it sarcastically, because at one point Killian says to him, you know, the only reason you live this long is because of me. You know I'm in control of all of this, right? And Richards sort of sarcastically says, oh really, I just took you for the house. And I think what King was going for in that scene, and I could be completely off the mark, but I feel like what King was going for was Richards in that scene was basically calling Killian an Uncle Tom, because Killian is working for this corporation that is oppressing the lower class, which includes a lot of minorities, including a lot of black people. And I'm sure a lot of the contestants of The Running Man, as well as these other game shows, probably are minorities. So again, I think that's what King was going for with that line. At the same time, considering that Richards, I'm pretty sure, is supposed to be a white man. Granted, in the book, they never outright state what Richards' ethnicity is, but if we assume Richards is a white man, that's not a good look at all to have the white hero of your novel refer to the black villain as that. Even if there is a certain context meant behind that word, it's very difficult to justify something like that, and I had actually forgotten that when I reread this, and when I was rereading this, I was just like, Stephen, what are you doing to us? And with all that being said, I'm sure I probably turned off a lot of people to this book, knowing that the main hero of the novel is kind of a problematic character. Now, casting aside some of the problematic aspects of the story and the problematic aspects of the Ben Richards character, so much in this book feels like it could be written today. And in many ways, the story is frighteningly relevant to today's society. Especially with how the novel deals with class issues, like the fact that the Games Network uses these game shows as a way to exploit the lower class and as a way to lie about the lower class. Like, they spread all this propaganda like, oh, these people are lazy, they don't want to work, and they're feeding off the middle class, and these people are also thieves and killers. And not for nothing, those are talking points you hear today, whether it's about poor people, or the homeless, or minorities, or immigrants. And on The Running Man, they really do make it look like these contestants are the worst people imaginable, so an ordinary citizen would want to turn these guys in and get these guys killed. Also, at one point in the novel, Richards is in Boston, I'm pretty sure it's Boston, and he's in sort of the projects, and he's taken in by this black family, and the little girl in the family is dying of lung cancer, and at one point Richard says, how does a 5-year-old get lung cancer? And then the girl's older brother, Bradley, talks about how the air is just so polluted. Like, basically the network is poisoning the environment, and rich people can afford, like, nose filters, whereas poor people can't. So they're basically poisoning the poor. And Bradley is part of this underground movement that is trying to expose the truth. And again, that feels so relevant to today with climate change and big corporations really being responsible for a lot of it. And also how the book satirizes and attacks the media and media manipulation. Like in the novel, contestants on The Running Man have to record these videos to send in to the network, and at a certain point, especially after meeting Bradley and his family, Richards tries recording these videos exposing the truth of what the network does, but the network edits the videos and manipulates the footage to make it look like he's saying something completely different and make him come off like the biggest asshole on the planet. And again, that's shit that they actually do on reality TV shows to make a contestant look worse or better. Honestly, that's shit that they do on the news now, especially with how sensationalized and biased the news has become, and especially with AI and deepfakes becoming a bigger issue in our world now. In many ways, this book was prophetic in ways that I don't think Stephen King intended. And the book perfectly satirizes not just game shows, but reality television, but this was written before reality television really became what we know it as now. This predates shit like Survivor and Big Brother and Fear Factor and crap like that. And I think the book also predicted just how exploitive reality television is, because in so many ways, even though most participants in reality TV shows, they are doing it willingly, but in so many ways, most reality television is sort of designed for us to point and laugh at its participants. Like the fact that so many people get a thrill from seeing Simon tear into somebody on American Idol, or seeing Gordon Ramsay tear somebody a new asshole on Hell's Kitchen or Kitchen Nightmares. You have shows like The Biggest Loser, and yeah, I know the point of the show is to get overweight people to lose weight, but the show is literally mocking its participants in the title. Or look at something like Fear Factor. Like, when that was on, there were people who were legitimately afraid that somebody was going to get killed on that show. And of course you have shows like Naked and Afraid and Life Stripped Bare, which deal with the participants literally bearing it all for millions of viewers. And granted, for a lot of these shows, these are willing participants, but at the same time, it plays into that idea of people humiliating themselves for money, or for like that 5 minutes of fame. Or even shows like Jackass, where the whole point is watching these guys inflict massive amounts of pain on themselves and each other. Keep in mind, I actually really like Jackass, and in Jackass's defense, it's not like random people who are signing up to be on that. It's like those guys doing it to themselves. But again, we all get this perverse pleasure watching these guys do these horrible things to themselves. And then you have a show like Cops that literally combines law enforcement with reality television. And granted, I know nobody's been killed on these shows, at least as far as I know, but in a lot of these reality TV shows, they are people basically humiliating themselves or exploiting themselves just to get money, which again, that's one of the main points of The Running Man. So yeah, The Running Man is a novel I always enjoyed. It is a flawed book. It's not perfect by any means, and there are aspects of the book that would definitely turn off a modern reader. Regardless, I think it's a very clever satire and a really solid piece of dystopian fiction. Now, it's funny that at the time this was published, King legitimately didn't want people to know that him and Richard Bachman were the same person, because if you're actually paying attention, there are subtle clues that you are actually reading a Stephen King novel. For example, there's a certain point in the book where Ben Richards ends up in Maine, and he's trying to get to this airport in this small city called Derry. Derry, which is a fictional town, by the way, is also the setting of Stephen King's novel It. Granted, this was written before It, but again, that's a pretty big clue right there that this is actually a Stephen King book. And that does beg the question, is this in the same universe as It, obviously set years and years in the future? Like, is the Derry that Ben Richards visits legitimately the same Derry from It, Insomnia, and Dreamcatcher? In my opinion, yes and no. I don't think this is actually in the same universe as It or those other books, because a lot of Stephen King's later books would also take place in the same universe as It, because a lot of his later books would make references to It or would refer back to It, or characters from It would appear in later Stephen King novels, and a lot of his later books are taking place closer to when The Running Man is supposed to be taking place, and there's no indication that the universe of King's books is becoming quite the dystopic hellhole that the world of The Running Man is. So in my opinion, The Running Man is set in a separate universe. But if we want to tie it in with Stephen King's Dark Tower series, which deals with the whole multiverse concept, perhaps The Running Man is actually taking place on a parallel Earth. What's referred to in that series as another level of the tower, because the titular Dark Tower of that series is supposed to be a representation of reality itself, and perhaps the Derry that Ben Richards comes to, it is the Derry from It, but in an alternate timeline or an alternate reality, or again, another level of the tower. Again, that's my interpretation, and admittedly I'm getting into sort of fan theory territory now, and I'm probably taking what was actually meant as a subtle in-joke way too literally and way too seriously. But look at a book like The Long Walk. If you're actually paying attention to The Long Walk, that book is set in an alternate universe. Now, I don't think The Long Walk is in the same universe as The Running Man, but at the same time, they almost could be, because thematically the two books are so similar, and I almost would call The Running Man a thematic sequel to The Long Walk. which is why it's sort of fitting that this year we had an adaptation of both novels. So The Running Man's been adapted twice. The first adaptation came out in 1987. It was directed by Paul Michael Glaser and written by Steven D'Souza, who also wrote Commando and Die Hard. And the film, of course, starred Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards. Now, if you've read the book and if you've seen the movie, you know that they're oceans apart from each other. Like, the movie takes the skeletal structure of the novel, throws everything else out the window, and really constructs its own story around it. Like, it's almost an adaptation in name only, although oddly enough, thematically I do think it's very true to the book, because thematically I do think both the book and the movie are saying the same things about the media and the government and society. The book obviously approaches it from a much more serious angle, even though there were some satirical things in the book. The movie approaches it from a much campier, much more comedic angle. Now, I do have to say that as an adaptation, the 1987 Running Man is a terrible adaptation of the book. But as a standalone movie, as an 80s action film, I actually like the movie a lot. I actually think it's a brilliant satire on television and the media and pop culture, and whether they intended it or not, it's also kind of a satire on 80s action films in general, and the kind of movies that Arnold Schwarzenegger was doing at the time. Again, whether they intended that or not, because there are moments in the film, and keep in mind, I love Arnold Schwarzenegger, but there are moments in the movie where he is kind of hilariously bad, and some of his one-liners in the film are just so... like, they're amazing, but they're also so fucking stupid. Like, you have lines like, Here's Sub-Zero! Now! Plane Zero! I mean, I'm sorry, that is such a stupid line. Yet it's kind of brilliant. It had to be done on purpose. That had to be done on purpose. You also have Arnold saying, "I'll be back," which of course is his most famous line from The Terminator. And again, that had to be done intentionally. Another one of my favorite Arnold lines in this is, "I'm gonna ram my fist into your stomach and break your goddamn spine!" The movie really does feel like it's sort of a parody on, again, the kind of movies that Arnold was doing at the time. Now, the Ben Richards in the movie is almost not even the same character from the book. In the movie, Ben Richards is a SWAT team captain who refuses to fire on unarmed protesters, so his superiors order the other men in the chopper to subdue him, and Richards is basically made as the scapegoat, and he's sent to jail, but he ultimately escapes from jail, but is captured again, and then is put on the Running Man, which in the movie is used as a way to execute convicts on live television. The movie also stars Yaphet Kotto as one of the other prisoners who escaped with Richards, who is also part of this underground resistance against this fascist government, and he ultimately gets captured again and is made a contestant on The Running Man. The movie also stars Maria Cachito Alonso as Amber, who is sort of the stand-in for the Amelia Williams character from the book, although she does have a much bigger part to play in the movie than she does in the novel. In the movie, you also have Richard Dawson, who at the time was probably best known for hosting Family Feud as the main villain, Damon Killian, obviously based on the character of Dan Killian from the novel. Now, in the novel, Killian was only the executive producer for The Running Man, and The Running Man was actually hosted by a character named Bobby Thomas, but basically for the movie, they combined the two characters into one, and that was just brilliant to have an actual game show host play the main villain in a movie that satirizes game shows. Now, as I said, in the novel, Killian is a black man, and ironically enough, had they stayed closer to the novel, Yaphet Kotto, I think, would have made a perfect Dan Killian. Now, in the movie, the Stalkers, who of course are based on the Hunters from the novel, they're a lot more colorful than they are in the novel, and a lot more over the top. Like, each of them has their own gimmick. Like, you have Dynamo, who sings opera and shoots electricity at the runners. You have Fireball, who obviously uses uses a flamethrower. You have Sub-Zero, who chops up people with this razor-sharp hockey stick. You also have Jesse Ventura as a retired stalker known as Captain Freedom that Killian tries to bring out of retirement when Richard starts killing all the other stalkers. And I actually liked that they gave this character actually a little bit of characterization. How he feels like Killian is really using him, and he feels like he's really being underestimated and short shrift by Killian. The movie also had Mick Fleetwood from Fleetwood Mac as the leader of the underground resistance, and the movie heavily implies that that actually is Mick Fleetwood, that this is Mick Fleetwood in the dystopic future, because his character actually is named Mick, and at one point, like when he first meets Richards, he doesn't trust Richards because Richards was once a SWAT team officer, and he says to him, "People like you arrested my friends and burned my songs." Again, it's heavily implied that that actually is Mick Fleetwood. Now, in the opening credits of the film, they do say, based on the book by Richard Bachman, even though at this point, King was already outed as Bachman. Now, apparently that was because Stephen King specifically requested that they keep his name off the movie because it is so different from the book. That, and apparently when they purchased the rights to the book, they didn't realize that Richard Bachman was Stephen King, and the producer Rob Cohen has even said, "How come this obscure little book by this author nobody's heard of? How come the rights cost so damn much?" Again, I actually think the movie is really fun. It's a terrible adaptation of the novel. It is nothing like the novel whatsoever, but again, if you can put the novel aside and just look at the 1987 film as its own thing, it's a lot of fun. And the movie, much like the book, definitely seems to have been kind of prophetic in terms of how it predicted reality television and how it predicted how politics and the news and entertainment would become so merged. I mean, literally our president now is a former reality show host. Now, it's funny that this movie came out the same year as Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop, because I feel like both this and RoboCop are kind of saying the same things about corporate America and about the media and about society in general. Like, both movies are these satires on corporate America disguised as action movies. And John Carpenter's They Live is also very thematically similar to The Running Man and RoboCop, and I actually feel like The Running Man, RoboCop, and They Live make a very interesting thematic trilogy, even though these three films are from three very different directors. Although, ironically enough, I actually think They Live is almost closer in tone and spirit to the book The Running Man than the actual Running Man is, at least in terms of how that movie deals with class. And actually, John Carpenter would have been perfect to adapt The Running Man. Now, the movie The Running Man did spawn a video game adaptation, and a case could really be made that The Running Man, both the book and the movie, had an influence on stuff like Battle Royale, The Hunger Games, The Condemned, and Squid Game. And this year, 2025, we had another adaptation of The Running Man, this one directed by Edgar Wright, who also directed Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and Baby Driver. Now, I was initially hesitant going into this because I wasn't sure if Edgar Wright was really the right, no pun intended, person to do a Running Man remake, and the trailers were really not doing it for me at all. But I enjoyed the film for the most part, and it is a much closer adaptation than the 1987 film, yet it still pays tribute to the 87 film and tries to be both a closer adaptation to the Stephen King novel and very much a remake of the Arnold Schwarzenegger film. And I would say for the most part it's fairly successful at doing that, but I will say, in my opinion at least, it's very watered down compared to the book, and I knew they were not going to have the balls to do the book's ending. Granted, I don't really blame Edgar Wright because In a post 9/11 world, there's no way a mainstream film would ever be able to get away with the book's ending. But because of that, the ending does not have the same emotional power that the book did. And honestly, the ending of the film really kind of felt like studio interference because, yeah, the ending was kind of bullshit. But I also have to admit that a lot of my problems with the ending are kind of just my own personal nitpicks because I am a fan of the novel. Now, the movie stars Glenn Powell as Ben Richards, definitely a lot closer to the Richards of the novel than Arnold Schwarzenegger was, and he does do a really good job in the movie. You also have Josh Brolin as Dan Killian. You also have Coleman Domingo as Bobby Thomas, who is the host of The Running Man in both the novel and in this movie. Slight edit, the character's name is actually Bobby Thompson. You also have Lee Pace as McCone, who is the leader of the Hunters, who, in both the novel and in this movie, is the secondary antagonist of the story, although this character was not in the 1987 film. You also have Michael Cera as the character of Elton, who is a character from the novel. However, in the novel, he's described much differently, but Michael Cera does a pretty good job for the brief scenes that he's in. You also have Jamie Lawson as Ben Richards' wife, Daniel Ezra as Bradley. You also have Amelia Jones as the character of Amelia Williams from the novel. You also have William H. Macy and Katie O'Brien in small roles. But again, it is an enjoyable film. I do recommend it, and there are some fun little Easter eggs, like Arnold Schwarzenegger's face is on the new dollar bills in the film, but I also wish they could have gotten an actual cameo from Arnold. There's also a store in the background called Bachman's, and they actually do go to dairy in the movie, and I was half expecting there to be sort of a Pennywise reference, like maybe at one point Richards passes a sewer grate and a red balloon is sticking out, but maybe that would have been a little too gimmicky and a little too tongue-in-cheek, but somebody like Edgar Wright I could see doing something like that, but they don't do that in the film, unfortunately, although the character of Elton, because in the movie Elton and his mother do live in Derry, and at one point he says Mom thinks the bathroom is haunted, and given that this is Derry, maybe it actually is. Like, maybe Pennywise actually does exist in this movie's universe. But I totally understand why they didn't want to throw any Pennywise references into this, because most people probably don't even realize that this is based on a Stephen King novel, so people going to the theater just to see an action movie might be like, what the fuck is this? And like I said, the movie, while I do have my problems with it, it does get more right than it gets wrong, and there are moments in the film that are almost word for word from the book. But again, for me at least, it felt a little watered down and did not have the biting edge that the book did. But that's also not surprising, because again, there are things in the book that they really, I don't think, would have been able to get away with. But yeah, that was my review on The Running Man by Stephen King, and long days and pleasant nights to you.